Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
And all these mood-altering drugs, alcohol or marijuana, are basically get-rich-quick schemes of I don't like what's going on around me and I want to change that.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn? What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today we are talking to Ryan Burke. He is an addiction therapist and an endurance athlete. Welcome, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk to you about your work as an addiction therapist because of the opiate addiction and also the fact that you've combined extreme athleticism with addiction and how you're working those two things together and working them out.
Yeah, the whole process for me has been kind of like intertwining these two worlds that I really love, the outdoor world and the addictions world. Seeing people kind of recover from addictions work has kind of become my life's purpose at this point. But I love adding in the kind of the side project in my mind, the hobby, and just seeing how that can be a replacement therapy for other folks as well.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Maine originally, East Coast, and moved out this way in 2004.
What was the reason that you moved here?
I always had kind of an attraction to Jackson, but from a distance, it seemed so extreme. I thought it would be out of my kind of pay grade. And when I was biking across the U.S., I came across Togety Pass and saw the Tetons, and at that point thought they looked impossible to climb. And then just slowly over time figured out a way to make them kind of my own. So yeah, it was a multitude of factors that got me here.
You are an extreme athlete. Do you call it an extreme or endurance athlete? What do you call yourself?
I mean, extreme is used. I wouldn't say that fits me. Endurance athlete seems to fit more. Extreme sounds more of like on the edge, gripped all the time, and that's not how I feel. I don't feel like my life is on the line that often. It's really just pushing myself harder and further than I have gone before.
And how did you make the journey in terms of entering into the world of addiction counseling and addiction treatment?
It somewhat fell in my lap after a long trip. I never thought I'd go into this world. I thought it was a little too complicated and not as kind of the outcomes weren't that great. Relapse rates are very high. So I wanted to go into something that was a little more feel good. But what I've found is quite the opposite, that I love the complexity of it, and kind of every person has a different knot to untie. So working through that and partnering with people has been truly rewarding.
So you started something called the Mindstrength Project, and it was in an answer to help people overcome addiction. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I work at Curran-Seeley Foundation, and it's a substance abuse treatment center. And at most outpatient treatment centers, the main kind of strategy is group therapy, which is an incredible resource to have a shared experience with other folks. But I saw something that was missing, and I wanted to add a little bit to it. People are learning skills, but they weren't practicing those skills under pressure. So the Mindstrength Project brings the skills you learn in a group and puts people under extreme duress in the outdoor world to see how they can stay composed under pressure. And hopefully that will kind of relate to how they feel when they're dealing with their cravings or dealing with intense situations in their own lives.
What have you learned about the opiate addiction and how it's affecting people?
Yeah. In my mind, opiate addiction and all addiction is really just a symptom of some deeper root causes. And that's what the Mindstrength really tries to get at, whether that's impulse control, ability to delay gratification, self-esteem, self-conscious problems. I feel like the opioid epidemic in general stems from, Americans kind of being addicted to comfort, wanting the quick fix as soon as possible, and the root cause dealing with just basically how people deal with stress in their lives.
I think that's really an excellent way of explaining the opioid addiction and epidemic, is that we are so used to comfort and we don't want any pain. But is a lot of it caused by depression?
Yes and no. I feel like they call addiction a disease of disconnection. And I think when you break it down to its core, that's what you really see happening. People disconnecting from the world around them, from their family and friends, and more connecting and attaching to things that are just, what in their minds, more predictable, that will always get them high, that will always be kind of more controllable than, say, a relationship. So people are reaching out to these things like social media, opiates, that just, in their opinion, just seem more within their control.
And are there differences between, say, alcohol addiction and narcotic addiction and opiate addiction? What are the differences there? Yeah,
there's a multitude of differences as far as their long-term consequences and short-term. But in the end, it all boils down to the same thing, that people want to avoid pain and seek pleasure as quick as possible. And those synthetic ways of doing it are replacing the natural ways in their life.
What is the cure rate for those?
It depends on what we're talking about. The relapse rates are very high for all forms of addiction. In my opinion, it's often called a disease, and I'm taken aback by that a little bit, because I really believe that it's, really a learning disorder, if nothing else. It's the brain doing what it's supposed to do. It's just hyper-learned an activity or a habit, and it kind of takes away the control from the person and puts it in your brain's hands, and your brain will make it happen if it thinks it's important to its survival, which when you do enough of a drug, your dopamine levels are affected, and you literally believe it's important for your survival. So you'll do anything, lie to family, steal, cheat, make some bad decisions just to get that drug of choice.
What kind of studies and research have you done so you can further help people and understand what are the remedies that you can put in place with families? Because obviously families are very affected.
Yeah.
Even if one person in their family is addicted, everyone is affected. What do you do about that?
Absolutely. Well, and this goes against some sort of the mainstream treatment program. A lot of the treatment programs focus on the problem. We'll just stop them from from using drugs. But the solution is usually something different, connecting them back with the family instead of punishing them. I talked about it being a disease of disconnection, and the hope is to connect them back. So a family therapy, focusing on things that help increase their positive identity, that create their identity as, say, an athlete, for instance, instead of being just an alcoholic or someone with an addiction, making people understand that that's a slice of who they are, but it's not the whole person.
In your program, the Mindstrength Project, what exactly do you do that helps people mend and heal in their mind?
Absolutely. So a big part of our program is intermingling them with other athletes in town. So they start to realize that they can be a valuable member of the community. That if they see themselves rock climbing next to a professional climber and they're doing, just as well on a workout or a physical and mental task, they can start to see themselves through a different lens. And that helps them kind of regain maybe that self-esteem that they once lost. So with the Mindstrength Project, we do things like having people tie knots underwater, do sprints or suicide sprints while doing a memory task. And a lot of that comes down to the neuroscience of basically when you're exercising, your brain is primed to learn and new brain cells are forming. So you have to attach that to new information or those brain cells will die off. So we try to get people energized into like a maximum heart rate and then teach them things like meditation or mindfulness that will teach them how to react when things seem outside of their control.
And how did you learn those techniques?
Oh, that's a good question. Growing up in Maine and then spending time out here in Jackson, I've really realized the importance of the outdoors in my own kind of identity formation. And as an alternative to getting drunk on a Friday night, I started to realize that my therapy time was running up and down mountains. And so I started to realize that I could use that time productively and kind of teach myself and messages to my brain that were helpful instead of detrimental. Instead of listening to my negative thoughts, I started to see things that I was grateful for and started to realize that the outdoor was my way to connect.
And I do see that as going outside as a way to connect with nature. But at the same time, when you see extreme athletes or even people who enjoy the outdoors,
they're still addicted to drugs.
Yeah, so that is a common issue, is that you can have kind of both. And what happens to most of the time is that, say you live in a mountain town, and even living here affects our dopamine and serotonin levels. So you have people who get really high in the mountains during the day, and then they get super drunk at night, basically because they haven't figured out a way to temper the issue of their neurotransmitters. So, with all type of kind of habit changes, you can't just say we're going to take away your drinking and not give you something else. So what I've tried to replace that with is meditation and kind of being that calm place and being okay with the problems in your life, realizing that the negative emotions that we call things are really just signs and symptoms that are telling you to pay attention. So we work a lot on labeling and integrating a little bit of Buddhism and meditation into a treatment plan.
I think it's interesting that you were able to figure that out for yourself when you saw yourself drinking and decided you were going to put your energy in another place. Was it who you surrounded yourself with? I mean, what was your inner discipline to make that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. I had some great role models and mentors, and I really do believe it's kind of who you surround yourself with. You become who you're around. So I had some great advocates that kind of pulled me out of that world, not through even conscious discussion, but just by showing me that it's more fulfilling to summit a peak than to get wasted and kind of ruin the whole next day.
So when you were biking across the United States, you obviously were an advanced athlete at that time. What was your desire to bike across the United States?
I didn't feel like one.
Oh, really?
My buddies and I started a nonprofit to help raise money for cancer research, and we were riding mountain bikes across the U.S., which is not the normal way. So I didn't consider myself an athlete at that point. I had never really run over 6 miles. I had kind of just been like, let's try it and see how it goes. So I had an optimism, but I think my athleticism really didn't even bloom until I started to see people around me that I saw on like the cover of Outside magazine. And I was like, wow, they're human. Maybe I can do what they do. And then I just started pushing my limits a little harder and a little further.
And what was your degree in?
I had a master's in mental health counseling, but my undergrad was in psychology and sociology.
Okay. Those are two great humanities subjects right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, critical thinking at its best. Yeah.
That's right. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about how other kinds of treatments that people are seeing success in with addicts and ways to help young people avoid addiction. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think education is a huge component of it. But I think I just went in the 8th grade classroom today, and we talked about the facts about drugs and alcohol. I think people need to have the ability to make their own choice. That's what I believe drugs and alcohol take away, is that people's power, their options. And so I believe like the neuroscience education and just saying this is what happens is the best way to deal with that. Scare tactics haven't worked. I think people do get very curious about drugs and alcohol and that get-rich-quick scheme. So I think just showing people that there may be short-term gains to using drugs and alcohol, but the long-term effect of like basically stealing your happiness from the next day is just important information. So just empowering people to make the right choice through science.
Is there quite a big drug culture in Jackson?
Yes and no. Mountain culture in general goes either like work hard, party harder, basically. And so people, say in high school, see that all around them. They see people jumping off cliffs and then getting super drunk that day and then going to do it again the next day. And that seeps in. We're all kind of products of our environment. So that extreme culture here goes both in the outdoors and to the bars.
Have you learned about the state as a whole in terms of what kind of drugs are going on in other communities around Wyoming?
I don't know any specific statistics. I know, obviously there's the big ones, alcohol and marijuana. Meth is also an issue in the state. Opiates and heroin are becoming more of an issue, and I see it more and more at Curran-Seeley. Just people kind of coming through the door that either they started on prescription drugs and then that led to harder drugs, and they don't want to do that. People in my opinion, that have addiction are very smart, kind, loving people. They just get caught up in over their head too quickly. A smart person can convince themselves to do anything, and I think that's what I see happening. I think there's a misinterpretation of people with addictions being victims, and I really want to see that change and have that kind of more convert to them as seeing themselves as survivors, because getting through addiction is by far the hardest thing that I've seen anyone go through.
Do you see marijuana in this picture? Do people consider it an addiction? What's the conversation about marijuana right now?
It's changing. With it legalizing in a few states, you start to see that it becomes, just in the common language, it's just not even considered a drug sometimes. But in reality, any chemical you put into your body is going to have an effect, especially on your brain. And marijuana in particular affects your temporal lobe, so that's motivation, and your frontal cortex. It creates a lot of plaque buildup, which over time can destroy a person's potential. But it's kind of it's not as dramatic as, say, doing meth, where you can see the physical side effects as quickly.
What do you think of that argument that people say that smoking pot is better than drinking?
That's a good question. I would say they're at least equal in my eyes. One you might end up on a couch. One you might end up in jail. But they're both kind of impacting a person's ability to move forward. And to me, that's not worth it. I consider suffering like basically anytime you want the moment to be different than it is. And all these mood-altering drugs, alcohol or marijuana, are basically get-rich-quick schemes of I don't like what's going on around me and I want to change that. And so for me, I can't rationalize it as easy as I used to. Okay,
so you've really had to confront that issue, because I'm sure a lot of young people confront you with that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and especially with marijuana, they say it's organic, don't panic. And true, it comes from a plant, but heroin comes from poppy plants. And what I try to tell people is that nowadays the THC levels have gone up so high that it's almost a synthetic pill at this point. It used to be 5% THC, now it's up to 30, 35. And dabs, which is a higher concentrate, is up to like 99% THC. So the old arguments aren't working as well, because you're starting to get, botanists and people who know how to crossbreed plants, and just creates a whole new animal.
So it's become so much more sophisticated.
Mm-hmm. And that's the issue with all drugs, is that you're fighting against a natural system, against evolution. Evolution wants to kind of avoid pain and seek pleasure, and alcohol and drugs do both of those things. And that's why addiction is such an issue, because you're working against your brain, and that's kind of can be your worst enemy at times.
So have you traveled around the state much?
Yes, not for work, but I have.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite places in Wyoming?
Ooh, that's a good question. I love Lander, Wyoming. I'm a big climber, but spent time also in the southern parts, like looking around Laramie, going 10 Sleep climbing as well. So I tend to go towards the more climbing areas, but the whole state is amazing.
It's good to hear that. I'm glad. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.